This paper is concerned with the question of why economic inequality has increased so dramatically in recent decades. Can you all hear me, by the way? Yeah, okay. So the work of a number of economists has documented the huge increase in inequality that has taken place in many parts of the world since the 1970s. The U-shaped graphs of 20th century income inequality in various countries, produced by Thomas Piketty, have quickly become famous. And there's one of them. These graphs show a downward trend in income inequality from the start of the 20th century until around 1970, and then a sharp upturn in inequality after, such that the income inequality in 2010 is very similar to the income inequality in 1910. And these trends are particularly marked in the Anglo-Saxon countries, such as US, UK, Australia, and Canada, as shown here, and also in middle-income emerging countries such as India, China, Argentina, Colombia, South Africa, and Indonesia. Now, there are many theories that offer explanations for this sudden change in inequality trends. For Piketty, the reduction in inequality in the early and mid-part of the 20th century was just an anomaly brought about by 2 world wars and unusual political conditions. His book suggests that in the normal functioning of capitalism, there is a continued increase in inequality because the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of growth, which he sums up with the equation of R being greater than G. Sheev and Stasavage have also argued that the post-war years were somewhat anomalous and developed the idea that the reduction in inequality in this period was due to increased taxation and redistribution that governments were able to implement because of the changed moral and social calculus that came after the experience of mass warfare, such that it became politically possible to tax the rich as a form of compensation because they generally did not fight in the war. In both of these approaches, it is assumed that rising inequality is the norm, and that what needs to be explained is the period when inequality declined. So the post-1970s rise in inequality then is just back to business as normal. Other theories focus on technological and economic changes to explain the upturn in inequality in the post-1970s period. Popular views include the idea that the increase in inequality is largely a result of skill-biased technological change, such as computerization, that has led to increased wages for skilled workers and decreased wages for the unskilled. Others emphasize the huge increase in wages of CEOs and senior management in large corporations, the top 1%, whose salary and benefit levels have skyrocketed in the past few decades. And yet others have argued that various features of economic globalization, such as increases in foreign direct investment and trade liberalization, have led to increased inequalities, particularly in developing countries. And whilst there is no doubt much truth in many of these theories, in this paper I want to take a different tack and look instead at some of the underlying political factors. Here the situation appears rather paradoxical, because this upswing in inequality has taken place at the same time as a major spread of democracy worldwide. Democracy has long been assumed to lead to reductions in inequality, and yet in the post-1970s era, we are seeing a significant increase in inequality in both the long-established democracies and also in the new so-called third-wave democracies in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. So this surprising situation thus deserves some critical attention. So in this paper, I will try to look at the changes in political representation and in the nature of democracy in the post-1970s era, and explore how these changes may be playing a part in the contemporary upswing in inequality. So in what follows, I will first outline some of the theoretical discussions that have taken place regarding the relationship between democracy and inequality. That's the first section. I will then briefly outline some of the major politico-economic changes that have taken place since the 1970s, namely neoliberalism, globalisation, and financialisation. And then in the main section, I will consider a number of ways that these changes have led to a transformation of democracy, and in particular, what I consider to be the de-democratization of economic policymaking. The conclusion will consider the implications of these changes for inequality trends and for the type of action that must be taken if levels of inequality are to be reduced. So, to start the first section. There is a long history of the idea that increasing democracy will lead to a decrease in inequality. 19th century elites resisted universal suffrage for this very reason, fearing that an impoverished majority would surely vote to appropriate their wealth and redistribute it more equally. The redistributionist threat of democracy was often expressed in terms of its incompatibility with private property. James Madison wrote in The Federalist, number 10, that, and I quote, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security and private property." Similarly, Thomas Macaulay, in his speech on the Chartists in 1842, expressed the view that universal suffrage would inevitably lead to the end of property and thus of all civilization. Now, there are three basic mechanisms by which the reduction in inequality can be expected to occur. Firstly, as exemplified in social conflict theory and median voter models, it is suggested that democracy will reduce inequality because median voters will vote for redistribution by taxes and transfers. Secondly, it is expected that since in democracies politicians have to compete for citizen support, they will tend to provide more and better public services in order to win votes. Since the provision of public services will disproportionately benefit the poor and also improve their ability to compete in the marketplace, this process drives the reduction of inequality. And thirdly, democracies have features that empower workers and facilitate their involvement in the political process. Thus, democracies allow freedom of association and collective bargaining, and this can lead to increases in workers' wages, again leading to reduction in inequality. However, against these theoretical expectations, attempts to show an empirical connection between democracy and inequality have been surprisingly inconclusive. Scholars using different data sets and different methodologies have not been able to come to an agreement about any general connection empirically between democracy and inequality. Some scholars appear to find a correlation, and while others do not. These studies use quantitative methods to compare a large number of different contexts of democratization. The inconclusiveness of these results, of the results in these types of study, has led some scholars to move to a more historical and qualitative approach, investigating particular historical episodes and undertaking an analysis of the specific political and economic dynamics at play. From these studies, a general picture begins to emerge. The democratization of Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries did indeed lead to a significant reduction in economic inequality. However, democratization that took place in Eastern Europe and Latin America in the so-called third wave of democratization in the 1980s and 90s did not lead to a reduction in inequality, and in fact, in many cases, led to an increase in inequality. While such a difference between these two different historical periods would explain why the regression analyses that combine many cases spread across different periods fail to find a correlation, it doesn't explain these two very different patterns themselves. Another body of literature has explored the connections between democracy and inequality in a different way. This literature has sought to explain the differing degrees of inequality that are exhibited in the long-existing European and American democracies. Some of these democracies have large welfare states, high levels of redistribution, and relatively lower levels of inequality, such as those in continental Europe and Scandinavia, while others have much smaller welfare states, low levels of redistribution, and correspondingly higher levels of inequality, such as the US and the UK. This suggests that there is no immediate or automatic connection between democracy and inequality, and rather invites us to look more carefully at the political processes by which democratic politics shape distribution and redistribution. Recent scholarship suggests that party political ideology, institutional features, and electoral systems all significantly affect levels of economic inequality. A major theme across much of this literature is that the redistributive differences in democracies are fundamentally due to the relative strengths of labour and capital as they are shaped by and play out in the political process. And I'll come back to that later on. Despite their differences, all of these approaches share in common a theoretical framework that assumes a closed economy, such that issues of democracy and inequality can be explored by solely focusing on domestic actors and processes. While such an assumption may have been plausible during the post-war years of embedded liberalism, when capital controls limited the global flow of capital and states were able to set their own economic and social priorities while trading with other states at arm's length, it is clearly not plausible in the post-1970s period in which capital flows have become increasingly global. In the context of economic and financial globalization, it is necessary to develop a broader, more transnational political economic analysis of actors, interests, and strategies. In other words, it's necessary to place debates about inequality and democracy in the context of globalization. So now just onto the second section to zip through some of the changes in the post-70s. So neoliberal globalization was initiated in the 1970s as a response to the slowdown in economic growth, high inflation, and associated crisis of accumulation. In this crisis context, industrialists, investors, and politicians all looked for new ideas and new ways to stimulate growth. And it was in this context that the Keynesian paradigm, which had dominated economic policy since the war, came to be questioned and was finally replaced by neoliberalism, and particularly by the ideas of Hayek. A fundamental idea of neoliberalism is that the economy is scientific and neutral, and that the dynamics of growth are a technical matter that can be understood and modelled by calculations and formulae. In contrast to the socially embeddedness of Keynesianism, in which efforts are made so that the economy serves the best interests of society, neoliberalism seeks to disembed the economy and have it function in a separate sphere. A key part of this is the idea that the economic should be kept separate from the political. Whilst this idea can be found in all capitalist theory and practice, the divide between the economic and the political is taken to new extremes in neoliberal thinking. Political and institutional matters are seen as factors which block the smooth running of the economy, and thus neoliberalism calls for a restructuring of the state in order to increasingly free the economic from political constraint. This idea, as I will discuss more below, has been fundamental in the post-1970s restructuring of the state. And in the process, I will argue, it has led to the removal of large areas of economic policy making from democratic oversight. Now, Hayek devoted considerable attention to the question of democracy, and his relation to it was rather ambivalent. While he claimed to be in favour of democracy, he also believed that it could lead to unhelpful interference in the workings of the economy. Thus, for Hayek, democracy was only acceptable if it was limited. By this, he meant that there should be constitutional limitations such that most economic matters would be carefully bracketed out of democratic control. In particular, he argued that governments should not have the right to raise taxes for the purpose of redistribution, and he argued strongly against any notion of social justice. In essence, his ideas about constitutional limits to democracy were effectively ways to ensure that the economic sphere would be carefully insulated from the demos, and thus that democracy's redistributive threat would be neutralized. And as we shall see, there have been many changes in this direction in the post-1970s period. Another important aspect of neoliberal thought was that the economy was fundamentally universal, and therefore should not be geographically limited in any way. Thus, the globalization of capital and its free movement worldwide was something that neoliberals actively sought to achieve. So it's important to remember that economic globalization, as it occurred in the post-1970s period, was not something that was purely driven by new technological innovations or by market forces. It was rather the outcome of specific policies that were designed and implemented by neoliberals who were part of new transnational economic policy networks, which also developed in the early 1970s. These networks, consisting of official organizations such as the IMF and World Bank, which has obviously been around beforehand, but also informal networks such as the G7 finance ministers and central bankers, which only started in the mid-1970s, and private transnational policy networks such as the World Economic Forum and the Trilateral Commission, which again started in the early 1970s. And today they are largely responsible together for the transnational process of consensus formation about global economic policy and the form of economic globalization that we have today. Now, space precludes a detailed discussion of all the nature of the post-1970s economic globalization, but the key elements that are worth noting here are A, the globalization of production, and with it the increase in the number and importance of transnational companies and the shift to post-Fordist approaches. B, the globalization of capital and the deregulation of capital markets, such that capital can move increasingly freely around the world. And C, the massive increase in the size and importance of the financial sector, which is now much larger than the real economy, and which has led to a new context of financialization, where financial motives, financial institutions and financial elites have become increasingly important in the operation of the economy and its governing institutions. So as we shall see, all of these processes, along with the increased globalization of economic governance, have led to significant reductions in democracy. And the next section will explore how this has happened. So now on to the dynamics of de-democratization. A number of scholars have argued that globalization may sever the link between democracy and inequality, in particular by enabling asset holders to move easily across borders in an effort to avoid redistribution, thereby preventing policymakers from taxing the rich in order to provide public services or transfers to the poor. While this is no doubt true, I think there is much more going on than this. In order to understand the rise in inequality that has occurred in the post-1970s period of globalization, it is necessary to look at the way that democracy itself has changed in this period. As David Held reminds us, a basic tenet of democratic theory is that the fate of the national community is largely in its own hands. In the context of neoliberal globalization of production and finance, this is becoming less and less the case. So in what follows, I will argue that globalization has led to a process of economic de-democratization in line with Hayek's basic ideas. I'm not claiming that there has been a complete erosion of democracy or that states have been washed away by global capital. Rather, I will try to show that decisions regarding the organization and functioning of economic matters have become less subject to democratic influence. And I will discuss three major ways that this has happened: by the direct removal of certain economic matters from political control, by increasing restrictions on the policy options available to policymakers, and by transformations in the structure of the policy-making process itself. So to start with the removal of economic matters from direct political control. The most obvious way that economic decision-making has become de-democratized has been the actual separation of major economic institutions and offices from political control. The most well-known example here is the separation of central banks from political oversight. Since the mid-1990s, the global economic policy consensus has been that central banks should be independent. What this means, of course, is that central banks, and therefore monetary policy, should be insulated from democratic reach. Central banks are not independent when they are removed from democratic political control, but rather they must now respond to the demands of financial markets and those who operate them. Instead of being controlled by democratically elected politicians who can set monetary policy for social ends in the best interests of citizens, monetary policy is instead governed by the financial markets and the interests of financial capital. Neoliberal discourse argues that monetary policy is a purely technical matter and thus best handled by experts and technocrats. However, as Epstein has argued, a political economy analysis highlights that the economy is inherently political and that monetary policy is in fact a contested terrain of class conflict, as finance, industry and labour all have different interests and different preferences regarding the goal of that policy. Thus, for example, the current policy of inflation targeting, whereby the main goal of central bank policy is to keep inflation low, mainly serves the interests of finance and industry, as it protects against asset depreciation and instead actually leads to asset appreciation. For labour, it would be better if the main goal of central bank policy were full employment. And for other sectors of society, it might be better if the main goal were to maximise investment. Macroeconomic policy can also be redistributive. Governments that retain control of monetary policy and exchange rate controls can use macroeconomic policy to raise revenues to fund government services and transfers. Countries that forsake this possibility, however, and opt for central bank independence and the ensuing policies of inflation targeting are not able to redistribute in this way, and their macroeconomic policies tend instead to favour elites. The point is that central bank policy is fundamentally political, in that the outcomes of its policies have social consequences and affect different sectors of society differently. However, the arrangement of central bank independence means that the goals of monetary policy are effectively set by the interests of capital, and that other interests are removed from the decision-making process. Now, central banks are not the only economic institutions that are being bracketed off from political control. Currency boards and sovereign debt management offices are similarly being made independent and thus being de-democratized in much the same way. And this in turn means that in many countries, policies regarding exchange rates and sovereign debt payments are being taken out of democratic control and instead being made in the interest of capital and the financial markets. In countries across the world, there have been a raft of new constitutions and legal changes which act to legally and permanently separate the economic from the political. And whilst this is in no way a homogeneous process happening everywhere in the same way, it is a process that one way or another and to differing degrees is unfolding in very many countries. In Peru, to take just one example, Tevainen has shown that after the transition to democracy and neoliberalism, a new constitution was developed that defined various areas as economic or financial and then legally insulated these areas from parliamentary control. In this way, the Peruvian Ministry of the Economy was given more power, and at the same time it was increasingly shielded from democratic accountability. And in other ministries, an increasing amount of policy making was transferred to special teams which are insulated from public accountability. Another way in which this has happened is through the new style trade agreements that have become widespread in the post-1970s era. As trade has increased, new legal structures to protect property rights have been developed and written into international trade agreements. Thus, many WTO trade agreements, NAFTA, and other transnational trade agreements such as TRIPS and TRIMS include provisions protecting the property rights of foreign capital over other rights. These rights are then insulated from present or future change as governments sign on their irreversibility. This means that future governments can be taken to private administrative tribunals and forced to pay for loss of expected profits if they make laws or regulations for the public good that might impact on the future profitability of a corporation. In this way, the political restructuring that is taking place today is being locked in for the future, and thus also restricting the democratic ability of future generations. Stephen Gill has called this process the new constitutionalism. It is clearly reminiscent of the type of constitutional limits that Hayek proposed. It serves to insulate certain important economic areas from democratic rule and popular accountability, and instead places them in the hands of transnational capital and the financial markets. Thus, in these fundamental areas of economic policy, the representation of capital is increased, while that of labour is decreased. Now we move to looking at restrictions in policy options. So while other areas of macroeconomic policy remain formally in the control of governments, a number of changes in the post-1970s global political and economic order have led to restrictions in the policy options that are available to domestic policy makers. These restrictions have come about in two main ways: by the shifting of certain aspects of policy making up to the global level, and by the disciplining influence of global capital. So to look at the global level first. It is well known that there are serious democratic deficits at the global level. The international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF are not democratic organizations, and in most of them countries are represented according to the amount of money that they put into the organization. Thus, low and middle income countries are seriously underrepresented in discussions that take place in these forums. The G7 and even the larger G20 also only represent a small number of countries and yet seek to make decisions that affect the global economy. And the unofficial transnational policy networks, such as the World Economic Forum and the Trilateral Commission, are based on membership by invitation, and as such mainly consist of political elites from the rich countries, directors and CEOs of transnational corporations, and people who are committed to neoliberal approaches. In short, capital is highly represented, while labour has very little voice at all. And rich countries are well represented, while poorer countries have far less voice. At the global level, economic governance is rather reminiscent of early 19th century European systems, where a small group of elites make decisions and the majority are disenfranchised. And yet it is in these networks, what Stephen Gill has called the G7 nexus, that broad economic policy consensus is formed, that in turn shapes the discourse within which domestic governments can make economic policy. Whilst these global networks do not directly set policy themselves, they define the discursive space in which domestic policies can be discussed. In this way, non-democratic global policy processes significantly restrict and shape the policy options available to national level policymakers. It's worth noting that very little of serious economic significance is actually discussed at the UN. This is particularly noteworthy because the UN, despite its many shortcomings, is actually the most democratic institution that exists at the global level. Whilst it can in no way be considered fully democratic, at least in the General Assembly and ECOSOC, there is representation based on one country, one vote. So at the very least, low and middle income countries and leaders not necessarily committed to neoliberalism have an equal voice in discussions. And it is through the UN that these voices have in the past expressed alternative views about how the global economy should be organized and governed. For contrary to neoliberal discourse, there are of course numerous alternatives regarding how to govern a globalizing economy. One view was presented to the UN by the G77 countries in the early 1970s, for example, regarding their ideas for a new international economic order. Now, here is not the place to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of their proposals, although it's interesting to note that they included regulation of transnational corporations, forms of global redistribution to diminish inequality, and the protection of national sovereignty, some ideas that are perhaps quite relevant today. But what is important to note, I think, is that since then, there has been no major discussion in any official global governance arena about alternative, non-neoliberal forms of globalization. Instead, the rich countries have made continuous efforts to shift discussions about economic governance out of the UN and into less democratic forums in order to maintain control of the outcomes. To give just one example that's happening at the moment, recent discussions about reforming elements of transnational tax policy, which, as we'll see below, is incredibly important for all countries, have taken place at the OECD, where only rich countries are represented, despite the calls of G77 countries to hold these discussions at the UN, where they would also have a voice. But what is important for our discussion here is that global policy processes are increasingly restricting national level policy making, and that these global policy processes are themselves severely undemocratic. This then is one way that national level policy making is becoming de-democratized. Another way that policy options have been restricted at the domestic level is by the dynamics created by the global mobility of capital. Instead of regulating capital for the good of society, governments are now forced to compete with each other to attract capital to their countries. They are thus induced to choose policies favourable to investors and transnational corporations and to demonstrate that they promote a good business climate. This has made it increasingly difficult for governments to pursue autonomous macroeconomic policy in a range of areas, including exchange rates, interest rates, taxation, fiscal policy, as well as areas of social policy and labour policy. A whole economic surveillance industry has developed with the IMF and the credit ratings agencies continually requesting economic data and information in order to analyse to what extent a particular country is good for business. The consequence of this is that governments have to increasingly set their economic policies to meet the wishes of these organisations, which all follow a neoliberal approach which favours capital over other interests. In order to make themselves more attractive to capital, countries are disciplined to lower corporate tax rates, reduce public spending, disempower unions so that labour can be made as cheap and as flexible as possible. This process, which Stephen Gill has called disciplinary neoliberalism, has led to significant changes in all of these areas in very many countries in the post-1970s period. I will focus on changes in fiscal and social policy because these are particularly relevant for changing patterns of inequality. And since the dynamics are rather different in richer and poorer countries, I'm going to consider them in turn. So start with looking at richer countries. The combination of neoliberal ideology and global capital mobility has led to a major restructuring of tax systems in most of the rich core countries. Average statutory corporate tax rates have fallen from around 50% in 1980 to around 30% in 2005, and further since then. At the same time, the tax base has been broadened by reducing investment allowances, depreciations, and other deductions. This restructuring has left overall tax revenues largely unchanged, and thus led early scholars to believe that the global tax competition was not in fact undermining fiscal sovereignty. However, more recent and nuanced studies have questioned this earlier optimism and have showed that the restructuring was itself driven by competitive pressures and that the outcomes of this restructuring are far from neutral. Cutting top corporate tax rates and broadening the tax base has meant that the tax burden has shifted from transnational corporations and global capital to nationally organized small and medium-sized companies, local capital, and from mobile to immobile economic factors. In this way, tax on labour has increased, while tax on capital has fallen. Furthermore, since governments like to keep top personal income tax rates broadly in line with corporate tax rates to stop tax avoidance as individuals incorporate themselves in order to pay less tax, the tax restructuring has also led to a decline in top-rate personal income tax, further reducing the tax burdens on the wealthy. Thus, the post-1970s tax restructuring has had important distributive consequences. These policy changes have not been legitimately chosen by the states involved, but in most cases are rather forced upon them by competitive pressures in the globalizing economy. In particular, governments are competing not only for foreign direct investment, real business activity, but also for paper profits, profits that transnational corporations shift from one jurisdiction to another through all manner of generally legal accounting procedures. Several studies have shown that the mobility of these paper profits is highly sensitive to tax rates, and thus that it is competition for this type of capital that is driving down corporate tax rates. Furthermore, as some countries set very low corporate tax rates and offer high degrees of secrecy, these paper profits are increasingly being shifted to tax havens and thus eliding the taxman in any country. Thus, while states still possess the formal right to set tax policies, they cannot effectively pursue certain desired policy goals. In other words, tax competition undermines the fiscal self-determination of states and significantly reduces their ability to effectively set the size of the budget and the extent of redistribution. Now, despite the relatively stable tax revenue in the post-1970s period in the rich countries, neoliberal reforms in social welfare policy have been common across all of the rich core countries. In the post-1970s period, firms and their interest associations have lobbied governments for rollbacks and efficiency-oriented reforms in national systems of social protection. They have also argued that social programs negatively affect profits, investment and job creation, and they have also used the threat of relocation to more favourable environments in order to put pressure on domestic policymakers. As I will discuss below, the ability of the private sector to influence government has significantly increased in the post-1970s period, and thus changes have increasingly been made in the direction of their wishes. Nonetheless, welfare states have not simply collapsed in the process, as many predicted. Democracy has not entirely withered away, and since welfare state cuts are extremely unpopular with the electorate in most countries, the process of rolling them back has been slow and difficult. But nonetheless, there has been a widespread process of change and retrenchment from the 1980s onwards. As Huber and Stevens, writing in 2001, say, we find that rollbacks and restructurings in welfare state programs have been a universal phenomena in the past 2 decades. Against earlier contentions that the welfare state was not changing, more recent studies have emphasized the significant changes in social services, social policy administration, pensions, education, industrial relations, and labor market policy that have taken place in European countries since the 1980s. Governments have periodically reduced income replacement rates, tightened eligibility rates, and limited benefit indexation for core social insurance programs. They have also employed greater targeting of benefits and encouraged the expansion of private insurance against labour market risks. Health and other social service programs have increasingly been subject to budget caps, user co-payments, internal markets, and other efficiency-oriented reforms. And in the heightened austerity of the post-2008 financial crisis era, where the public purse has run increasingly dry to the costly bank bailouts and stimulus packages, welfare states are again facing more retrenchments as cuts are made to public services and transfers to the poor. Nonetheless, there has not yet, at least, been a wholesale dismantling of the welfare state. Most significant rollbacks have occurred in countries whose political institutions act against pro-welfare state coalitions, such as the Anglo-liberal political economies. Welfare states in Scandinavia and continental Europe, where organised labour has more power and where electoral systems based on proportional representation more often lead to left-wing governments, have proved much more resilient against the pressures of globalisation. Thus, democracy has not been completely eroded, but the economic pressures of globalisation have clearly placed restrictions on fiscal and social policy and driven them in a certain direction in most of the rich countries. Now, in poorer countries, things have been much worse. And in particular, tax competition has proved a much bigger problem. While developed countries have been able to maintain the size of the budget by broadening the tax base and compromising on the extent of redistribution, developing countries have not been able to prevent revenue losses. Since the 1990s, their tax revenues have been dramatically reduced as they have been forced to reduce corporate tax rates, offer tax holidays and other incentives in order to attract foreign investment. African countries, for example, have experienced a 20% decline in corporate tax revenues just in the 10 years between 1999 and 2000. And it's estimated that the annual revenue loss of all developing countries is in the order of $160 billion. Now, just to put that in context, the total amount of money given in development aid per year from all the countries and all the international organizations is about $130 billion. So in the context of reduced tax revenue, developing country governments have been forced to either cut public spending or to take foreign loans to pay for it, or in many cases a combination of the two. As a consequence, public spending on infrastructure, service provision and welfare has plummeted in many countries since the 1980s. At the same time, many countries have taken loans in order to ensure that at least a minimal public spending can continue. There has thus been a huge increase in the value of the sovereign debt of developing countries in this period. Now, it's well known that the ability of governments in developing countries to set their own macroeconomic policies has long been restricted by the conditionalities attached to loans from the IMF and World Bank, and that these conditionalities have forced such countries to open their economies and implement neoliberal policies. With the increasing levels of sovereign debt in the post-1970s period, these dynamics have increased and also transformed as governments have increasingly begun to take loans from private commercial banks. Now, a government's ability to attract credit and the cost of credit is largely determined by its credit rating. This is a rating that private credit rating agencies, such as Moody's and Standard & Poor's, give to a country after assessing the risk that it will pay back its loans. Most importantly, if a country's credit rating goes down, then the cost of interest on its debts will go up. Thus, in the post-1970s context of high indebtedness, developing country governments have been disciplined to enact policies that will please the ratings agencies. In this way, private credit rating agencies have become new sites of economic governance. Backed up by the prospect of loss of access to international credit markets and debilitating capital flight, the demands of the financial markets, filtered through the credit rating agencies, have seriously constrained the policy options available to many governments in low and middle-income countries. Now, the types of policies that please credit ratings agencies are those that prioritize interest payments on debt over other forms of government spending. In this way, governments have been increasingly disciplined to impose austerity policies and reduced government spending. Robert Cox has noted how the Mexican government had to abandon an agricultural reform designed to expand medium-sized farming for local consumption goods, which would have been beneficial to many of its citizens, and instead revert to large-scale production of luxury export crops in order to earn dollars to serve the country's debt. Giselle Datz has argued that the Argentinian government's attempts to please the ratings agencies in the 1990s was the main driver leading to the subsequent collapse of the Argentinian economy, recession, a ballooning of its national debt, and increased poverty and inequality. And Laura Baer has shown that as interest payments on government loans in India rose from 18% to 29% of GNP in the 1980s and 90s, the requirement to make the interest payments came to dominate economic policy making, leading to the implementation of neoliberal reforms and austerity policies. Certain agencies of the public sector became sites of centralized accumulation as the government sought to suck resources from them in order to pay off their external debt. Thus, the Calcutta Port Authority, where Baer focused her study, was disciplined into cutting costs by reducing the workforce, shifting to more precarious forms of labour employment, and renting out land to the private sector in an effort to channel money to the central government. And across government, funds that could have been spent on public services or social provision were instead directed to pay off external loans. Another change in the nature of sovereign debt in the post-1970s period is that it has been increasingly financialized. It is now packaged and repackaged in different forms of securities and traded on the bond market. In this form, it is divided and traded amongst multiple investors, many trading in short-term and speculative frames. As the value of the debt thus rises and falls according to the swings of the bond market, governments are faced with increasing uncertainty regarding the value of their debt. This further makes economic management extremely difficult. As a result, argues Laura Baer, economic policy becomes focused on appearing as a well-behaved debtor to an atomized marketplace of multiple bondholders and debt instrument investors. Quote. Thus, in all these ways, developing countries have further lost their ability to determine their own macroeconomic, fiscal and social policies. Okay. A third way that economic governance has been significantly de-democratized in the post-1970s period, and now I'm really returning more to the richer countries here, has been by changes in the structure of domestic policy making itself. Neoliberalism and globalisation have led to major restructurings of the public sector in many core countries, and this has led to significant reductions in the democratic accountability of the policy-making process. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a number of observers began to argue that governments had become, quote, overloaded. In response, Margaret Thatcher and other politicians started to shed the load by privatising state-run businesses and by increasingly subcontracting and outsourcing government service provision to the private sector. Another aspect of the overloaded government debate at the time was the argument that governments had become overloaded by the demands of their citizens. For example, the Trilateral Commission published a report in 1975 entitled The Crisis of Democracy, which argued that as citizens had become more active and politically empowered, they were demanding more services and more redistribution, and this was posing a major challenge for governments. The diagnosis of the report was that there was an excess of democracy, and therefore the solution was to limit democracy. So the crisis of democracy wasn't that there wasn't enough democracy, there was too much. Now, while the report did not specify how this was to be achieved, it's perhaps no coincidence, therefore, that both of the major changes that took place in the public sector in the following years have had the effect of taking many areas of policy making out of democratic control. Two new approaches were developed at this time: New Public Management Theory, or NPM, and Governance Theory. Both promoted their changes in the name of cost-cutting and efficiency. NPM can be seen as an extension of neoliberal theory as applied to the public sector. It calls for governments to embrace private sector management strategies. One aspect of this has been the call to devolve decision-making to smaller units, which can in turn compete against each other in order to reduce costs and improve efficiency. In effect, it seeks to create internal markets within public administration. But in moving decision-making to lower level of agencies, political oversight is greatly diminished. Whilst NPM theorists are aware of this issue, they justify their approach by claiming that it is the outputs that confer legitimacy rather than democratic processes of accountability. In their view, citizens signal their choices as customers of services rather than as citizens who vote. But in such a market-oriented view of representation, citizens can choose between service providers, but they cannot vote for more or different services. And in the process, the democratic accountability of elected representatives is severely reduced. Governance theory, in turn, advocated a shift to a more decentralized form of policy making, whereby policy decisions will be made in collaboration with other stakeholders and non-state actors, particularly the private sector. The rationale for this change was that by engaging with a wider range of stakeholders, the public sector would be able to mobilize private sector resources in pursuit of common goals. This has led to a shift from centralized decision-making by government to dispersed decision-making in policy networks, in which government officials participate alongside representatives from transnational corporations, business associations, and civil society groups. In practice, this has led to a situation where policy decisions are increasingly made in forums that are not subject to democratic or parliamentary scrutiny. At the same time, it has led to a situation in which the private sector has become directly involved in public decision-making. Now, while some have argued that this new form of policy-making is in fact more democratic than top-down government, because a wider range of stakeholders are involved, including also NGOs, consumer groups, and other elements of civil society, it must be remembered that the resources available to large companies, transnational corporations, and business associations to engage in these processes is far, far greater than that available to civil society groups, many of which are poorly funded and under-resourced. As one commentator noted, it is like lining up rowing boats against battleships. It would seem rather that the shift to decision-making in multi-stakeholder policy networks has led to an increased representation of capital in the policy-making process. So, all of these changes, taken together, add up to a really rather significant transformation in the nature of democracy. The policy-making prerogative of states has been redistributed up to the supranational level, down to lower state levels, and across to the market. And in contrast to the state, these new arenas of decision-making are largely insulated from democratic control. In this way, economic issues have been depoliticized and increasingly removed from the arena of electoral politics. Furthermore, in each of the shifts that I have discussed, the representation of capital in economic policy-making has been significantly increased, while that of labour has been correspondingly decreased. Thus, I would contend that we are not just seeing a transformation of democracy, as some scholars have argued, but rather that we are witnessing a process of de-democratization. So to conclude, I would like briefly to make 3 points. The first relates to the discussions about the theoretical and empirical relationship between democracy and inequality with which the paper opened. I suggest that the reason for the different relationship between democracy and inequality in the first and third wave democratization, and thus the reason that the large-scale regression analyses fail to find a correlation between democratization and reductions in inequality, is because since the 1970s, democracy itself has been de-democratized. It would perhaps be interesting for future studies to use more nuanced indicators of democracy that take into account the degree of democratic control over economic matters, and then to see how the correlations look in that case. My second point relates to the questions of why inequality trends changed so abruptly in the 1970s, and why inequality has increased so much since then, and in so many countries of the world. As I've tried to show in this paper, my suggested answer to this question is that the underlying reason for this upswing in inequality is because of the de-democratization of economic policy making that has taken place in a number of different but related ways in the post-1970s period. I have tried to show how the trinity of neoliberalism, globalisation and financialisation have led to a situation where the economic has been increasingly separated from the political. I have also argued that this has not happened by accident, but that the limitation of democracy, or what I call de-democratization, is something that is fundamental in the thought of Hayek and other neoliberal thinkers. In all of the changes that I have documented, the representation of capital has increased while the representation of labour has decreased. Thus, economic policies have increasingly been made in the interests of capital, and the class compromise of the post-war period has been undermined. These structural political changes, I contend, are the fundamental reasons that underlie many of the more proximate causes of the upswing in inequality in recent years. And my third and final argument is that if this analysis is correct, it has major implications for how we should go about tackling the contemporary rise in inequality. It implies first and foremost that in order to reduce inequality, it is imperative to democratize economic policy making at both the global and the national level. This would mean devising ways to both democratize global economic governance and to re-democratize national-level economic governance. It could involve a process of bringing policy-making back from the decentralized networks and interstate structures at the national level, alongside the creation of state-like structures at the global level, which would be able to regulate global capital for the good of society, and through which policy alternatives, such as, for example, global social democracy, which people like David Held have talked about, could be democratically debated, possibly in some form of global parliament. Or it could involve devising ways to democratize decentralized policymaking in national and global policy networks and in national and international financial institutions. But however it's done, if we are serious about tackling inequality, then we must be serious about democracy. Thank you.